article about looking forward to liberty when you were talking about the Tea Party movement and how they seem to be based on looking backwards to what you call the golden age now. And I think that's a really important point. But there is a component of the Tea Party movement I like. It's kind of a populist discontent with something. However, they're being corralled and steered, you know, by the Republicans into a certain direction. So I actually think, even though you wouldn't normally think of the tea baggers as on the left, the populist part of it is, if they're against the bailouts, the banker bailouts. And remember that like 95% of the people in the Tea Party movement are like, they're not ideologically pure, they're just like kind of rustled up discontent, you know, and so people can use them and channel them, which is what's happening. But I don't
also, if you remember that Ron Paul's a classical liberal and not a conservative,
right?
Then if Ron Paul represents the actual moderate left in this country, then they're at least left of what you would consider conservatives, that to the extent that they're populist and insurrectionary.
So it's the right direction anyway.
Right.
What's that website again?
It's ALL-left, all left.
.net.
.net. Yeah, I have gone to a couple of tea parties, given out literature, talked to people a little bit, and you see a lot of different things there. And from reading some of my friends' blogs, like Thomas Knapp blogged about it in St. Louis, and he had a kind of a different take on what was going on. So I think that that's evidence too. There is a lot of local initiative in the tea parties that they are so different. And yeah, I think a lot of these people, they realize that something's going really wrong with the system, but all they really have to fall back on is this rhetoric of liberty that America is supposed to represent. And rather than looking at the good things that came out of 1776, they say they actually have signs. The answer to 2008 is 1776, which I think the answer would be 2009. The answer to 2008 would be 2009. But so we got to move forward with that. And yeah, there's a populist element. Just real quick, I'd mention the Russian Revolution. There were a lot of workers' councils and farmers' councils going up after the Tsar fell, and they weren't really politically aligned. And I think the fact that they didn't really have much of an ideology, I think, kind of helped the Bolsheviks take them over and become the ideology. So I think something to keep in mind. All right, Nick, and then you're
Daniel.
Daniel.
Yeah,
okay.
your comment about not being conservative, not conserving, not deprogressing is good. I think looking back at the past but not trying to relive it is good. It sort of reminds me of at the end of The Great Gatsby, where they're talking about rolling forward but looking back at the past at the same time. So you're progressing, but you're making sure you're looking back at your past so you learn from it.
Yeah, and I think I put this in one of my Center for Stateless Society pieces, probably one about the Tea Party, that there's this slogan, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's not those who cannot remember the past are condemned to innovate. We remember the past so we don't make the same mistakes, so we actually learn from, so we can apply it to our present situation and move forward.
Yeah.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, so I just had a comment. Maybe comment and question, but thinking in terms of things as left and right, I think that actually restricts the way you think. And so I would assert that this left-right paradigm is bullshit. And and what I would say is that there are ideas, and there's different ideas, and ideas should be considered either good or bad based on their merits. And that's the only evaluation. It doesn't matter what you call it. If you call it left, you call it right. This is the idea. It's good because whatever, or it's bad because whatever.
Well, I kind of come down in the middle of that. It does matter what you call something, but a label is not something to kill and die for. It's something that you use as a shorthand or you use to facilitate communication. I wouldn't go to say, to a Tea Party and be like, hey, I'm a left libertarian, you want this left libertarian, free market socialist stuff, or anything like, it's like, hey, this is some radical free market stuff. And, if they talk to me like, oh, well, this is capitalist, this is socialist, like, I try to kind of break down, okay, well, I think capitalism and socialism means different things. To me, I would tend to use them as this, and it's important to examine these labels, but yeah, we shouldn't get hung up on you got to go left. But I think that it's helpful to think in terms of left. I think Brad had.
Oh, I was just going to have a little comment. I just want to say I really like that comparison of basically the Tea Party groups are the equivalent of the grassroots workers' Soviets, and the Republican Party would be the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about that. You know, the Tea Party, there is a lot of potential there. I mean, these people, if they had the right kind of ideas that they were exposed to, there's all kinds of organizing, and these people are really ready to do stuff, but they're just kind of marching around and throwing their weight behind certain politicians. They're not like organizing alternatives to the state, and if they're that pissed off at the system, it seems like you don't have to approach it dogmatically like, hey comrade, let's build our revolutionary commune here. It's like, hey, you don't need the federal government telling you what to do. You have neighbors, you have friends, you can build networks among them, trade consensually, and then sneak a little anti-authoritarian sentiment in there, and I think it's kind of, you can set them in the right direction. I think Charles was next, or Nick, or
I forget what it was
actually. Let's say Charles then.
Well, yeah. Well, so one way that you might think about that kind of stuff is just that because I think a lot of the Tea Party movement is as hitched up as they are to electoral politics at present. They're sort of obviously dissatisfied with the options that they have, but they don't necessarily have figured out yet, well, okay, so how can we get out of the electoral politics as a way of getting things done? And sort of naturally fall into is they just kind of, well, there are these two major parties, and we'll kind of pick the one that subculturally we feel the most comfortable with, which for most of these people, coming as they do out of sort of more culturally conservative backgrounds, that tends to be the Republican Party. And so you get plans to take over the Republican Party, or just to elect more Republicans like the kind of Republicans they like, or things like that. And like, if you can work out a way to give them sort of a more positive alternative to that, like you said, sort of building social relationships with your neighbors and building sort of alternative trading systems and things like that, then there's a lot more hope for sort of the direction that they may go. In the meantime, what happens is that the socialist writer was August Bebel, I think, would describe anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools, and what he meant by that is that a lot of people in Europe would get attracted to anti-Semitism because they saw there's something profoundly wrong with the prevailing status quo. And like, maybe it has something to do with the financial system, but then they didn't really have a clear idea of where to go from there, and so they just sort of slid into sort of conventional prejudices. Oh well, okay, so that means the problem is not like the banking system. The problem is the Jews, and so you get people who started out from this populist sentiment going into very dark places as a result of that, and sort of because when you're stuck in this conventional paradigm, you just sort of start looking for scapegoats, and you start going on the basis of sort of what you feel
One way to
comfortable
look
with.
at that might be this: when people realize that the ideas that they've had have to change, they're not necessarily going to gravitate towards the best ideas. They're going to gravitate towards the ideas that are best marketed,
or that they're comfortable with, maybe. Which we have to change the way they identify with the ideas.
Right. Well, I mean, if it's been marketed to them by repetition and exposure, then that's going to be what they're most comfortable with.
Okay, Dan, I think you had something. I just wanted, before you go, I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. One, Charles mentioned that they're going with what they're most comfortable with, and I think that culture is really what you're comfortable with, what your background is, what meets your emotional and physical needs. I think gets a lot more allegiances than people want to admit. So I think that's a big thing we have to look at, and I kind of touch on that in Czarlist's strategy of propaganda, and I think Alliance number 2. That the state, it meets people's needs. Well, how can liberty meet people's needs for to feel like secure, to feel like camaraderie and things like that? So I think that's another thing that left is valuable for. And also we're talking a lot about the Tea Party because that just came up. But of course this was on libertarian left, and there's a lot of anti-authoritarian leftist movements. I mentioned that there's a major difference in within like student movements in like California, New York, where they're occupying buildings. Yeah, there are your Marxist-Leninists. There are your people who are going to be like, they're aspiring to be the next Obama, and then you have people who are actually like, yeah, self-organization, and there's which isn't to say that maybe I don't know firsthand well enough to say what kind of influence they have, but if it's there, that's better than having nothing there. So that's something to work with. So Din.